a variety of very interesting new thoughts. I remember mapping railway travel and migrants right from the first few surveys to lots of insights and questions about the nature of the Indian economy, its growth and development model, and where it's headed from here on. Much of that is in the book in a far deeper way, and it is a very interesting read because as you read it, you will see how Dr. Subramanian's thoughts have sort of evolved over the 4-year period, or progressed, or how do I say, transported over the 4-year period. So congratulations on a very insightful, engaging, and fabulous book. And thank you, everybody, for being here this Sunday evening. I know Sunday is a tough day to leave home and get out, but this is going to be well worth it, or at least I hope so. I'm going to start by asking Dr. Subramanian for his view on where the economy stands today. Because since you left, we had crude prices that soared. We looked like we were in a very shaky situation in the economy. Since then, crude prices have come back. But the GDP print number has not been very encouraging. Agrarian growth has not been very encouraging. The numbers are low. The current account deficit has moved up to 2.9%. And things looking a lot tougher at this point in time than they were in the beginning of the year.
Yeah. First of all, let me thank Meru and all of Penguin Random House for having done an absolutely terrific job of bringing out the book in a very short space of time. Meru, of course, has done a great job, but Varun, Shantanu is here. Then this morning I met Gunjan, the cover designer. Thanks to all of you for a really wonderful job. Thanks to all of you coming, as Menaka said, on a Sunday evening, and thanks to Menaka for hosting this. Now, on the economy itself, I have to use the mic. Okay, yeah. I thought I was mic'd up. Both, I see. Okay, as if my voice is not loud enough. I think that if you just step back to 4 years ago and say, I think when I wrote the first survey, I called that a sweet spot in India's history, because there was a combination of this political mandate, which was kind of unusual in our politics, and soft oil prices. So it kind of gave a window of opportunity. But then I cautioned against unreasonable expectations, because I said that generally in a country like India, where there's so many veto points and checks and balances, not just across institutions, but vertically between the center and the states. And I used a phrase which Martin Wolf kindly also repeated, which is that I said what we should expect is I'm trying to recall the right words, a creative, incremental and comprehensive, a creative, imaginative incrementalism, okay, or a bold incrementalism, not a kind of big bang. So, and I think, looking back, I think that early moderation of expectations that I did was perhaps, important, because you do realize that India is such a complicated country and things are so difficult to push through. Now, so coming to the present, I think that moment of oil prices then, gave us a cushion on the fiscal side. And so it was interesting that for the first 3 or 4 years, all of us said macro under control, micro reforms and structural reforms. And then just as I was leaving, it kind of got inverted a little bit, where the macro came under pressure because, oil prices went up, US interest rates went up. And so we had, I think it's fair to say, 2 to 3 months of genuine anxiety about our macro vulnerability. Of course, it was something that most countries, some other emerging market countries were also experiencing. But India was not spared that. And I would say that there were some India-specific reasons for concern as well. But luckily, I think we've gotten over that. Inflation has come down, so the macro seems to be, a little less vulnerable than that time. But then again, now the focus is shifting back to growth, where we've seen, as you quite rightly said, a slowdown. My own view is that I think we have to brace ourselves for a slowdown for some time. And I say that for a combination of reasons. I think, first of all, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, the financial system is under stress. Financial conditions are very tight. So this is not conducive to kind of rapid growth because we need financing and that's continue to remain tight. Agricultural sector remains under stress, which is something that I did work on with my team for about 3-4 years. That is vulnerability kind of remains. I think also the international environment is getting much softer. There's a global growth slowdown. Europe is slowing down. Japan is slowing down. The yield curve has inverted, so we think there may be a broader slowdown, which means that while the vulnerability on oil then will remain in check, I think our growth, our exports will also be soft. And then, of course, I think we should be honest in acknowledging also that, there are political calendars and, at some moments in the calendar, things are more easy to do than other moments. So I think that to expect, huge reforms that will perk up the economy at this stage of the cycle probably would be somewhat ambitious. So for a combination of all these reasons, I think we should brace ourselves for, a period of slow growth. And then, then we'll have to see what policy actions are taken, how the external environment changes, and then we can, think about really perking up the economy again.
Okay. I wanted to ask you this question, not because it's the generic financial journalist question to ask, saying where is the economy, but also it sets the context for the 4 years or, the 4 or 5 years that we've seen right from the time where we got this big oil price bonanza to now where a lot of this is going away and we have to face up to the reality of a slowing world as well. In that context, I want you to talk about what does a chief economic advisor do? Because I think you've started your book by saying there is no clear job description. And then you've said there is no real obligation on anyone, anywhere in government to consult the CA on any policy issue. So what does the CA do?
See, I'm glad, I hope for all the criticism I should probably get, being unemployed is not a criticism.
I wasn't suggesting it.
But no, see, it's something that I actually discovered. Look, that apart from writing a survey and providing some kind of inputs into the budget process, the CA is not someone who, is entitled to be consulted on matters. And in some ways, that's how I think it should be. I think, a CA should prove themselves to be worthy of consultation. And they have to earn that I think, that right to be consulted. And so what it means is that a lot depends upon what the CA does, what kind of team he builds, what kind of relationships he forges, and generally how he kind of acquires credibility and legitimacy in the system. So it's actually a really an open-ended brief for a chief economic advisor. It also, by the way, to be fair, it also varies according to the government in power, the structure of decision-making, the finance minister, his personality, and all those kind of imponderables that we talk about. So in that sense, it gave me the freedom to kind of make my own way through the system. And I found it an absolute joy and delight to have that freedom to do the things that I wanted.
Okay, forgive me for being tongue-in-cheek, but you know where I'm going with this, right?
Please.
You said that there is no clear definition and the CA has to prove his or her worth to be consulted on issues. Okay, before I get to where I want to get with this question, I'll ask you a quick one and a short answer to this one, because we'll come to the longer version of this later. What did you think was your influence on this government and therefore your key successes and key failures? Short one, itemized, and then we'll get into the details later.
I think the key successes. You see, here's where someone I respect a lot asked me this morning, why didn't you write more about what you did and whatever the successes or whatever. See, the problem is that even as I start saying things, it can start sounding overly self-congratulatory. So I don't want to say I did A, B, C, D.
I've opened the window.
Okay. So I think that what I really recall with great honor and thing is, first of all, first and foremost, the advice that you provide on policy issues. And I think being involved with the GST, with the journey, including with some wonderful colleagues, Amitabh is here, to be part of that journey was just tremendous. And I said, when the Constitution Amendment Bill was passed, something like 400 to 0, I mean, that was an epic moment. Hasmukhji and I, we hugged each other. And it was a wonderful process to be part of that. So that, I think, I would keep that with me forever. I think the other thing is, of course, forging team. As I was writing the acknowledgements, I worked with all of the people in the Ministry of Finance, but also to build a core team of 25, 30 people, and really build a team to do these things was also a great honor. Of course, the economic surveys which came out, I think people generally like that. I think, providing macroeconomic policy advice on a daily basis, both obviously to Mr. Jaitley, but also to the PMO, and being involved was, I think, a real honor. One of the things that I didn't say, which I haven't talked about enough, is the course that I did. I did an online course on the Indian economy, which was a great experience. Lots of people, I think, I get lots of thanks to the efforts of my team. We did a course which was also great,
failures.
Failures, I think there were. I think there was lots of failures, right? I think,
a few.
I think, for example, the agricultural sector remains, I think, a work in progress. I think that is one. I also think that to some extent, the GST, it's certainly not a failure, but it could have been more along the lines of what I had initially recommended. Maybe some of the challenges may have been marginally diminished because of that. And then, of course, the fact is that if you give advice, if 100 pieces of advice, by definition, I think it will be heeded about maybe if you have a success rate of 20-30%, I think you're doing very well in this business. But you should also ex ante have the humility to recognize that should be the realistic expectation.
Sure.
To think that 70-80% will get heeded is simply you're fooling yourself, and you're simply unaware of the political realities of decision making in government. There's one success that I also value a lot is we did things for the some sectors, for example, clothing sector, we did a package. Oh yeah, but what I think the thing that I want to say, which I forgot, was that I felt when I came that whatever I do, I will communicate it and try and raise the level of public debate on economics in India. I think probably I didn't succeed or whatever, but every piece of work that I did, I would have, meet the press, explain things, have PowerPoints on the surveys, as you know. So that, because I think that what I think Pratap Mehta calls, public reason, the need for public reason in democratic politics, especially for policy decisions, to work towards that and to try and build that. And this is what I would urge my successor also to do, that, this is not just a narrow sitting in North Block, talking to a few people. It's much bigger than that.
Okay.
Sorry for the long-winded answer.
No, it's okay. It was supposed to be itemized, but anyways,
okay.
Yeah. That brings me to what I really didn't want to talk about, but now I will talk about. I didn't want to talk about demonetization. Okay. I genuinely didn't. I promise you.
Let me just say, I respect your right. You have every right to ask the question, and I have every right to
dance around it.
Exactly.
No, I didn't want to talk about it because so much has been said and so much has been written. But then you've included a chapter in your book called Speaking Truth to Power. And I thought that it would be therefore unfair for me not to bring that up and hold you accountable to that very chapter and ask you, Dr. Subramanian, please tell me why you have asked several questions of the impact of demonetization in your surveys to deify or demonize, in your book, Puzzle 1, Puzzle 2. As yet, you have not passed judgment on whether you think it was a good thing to have done for the economy or a bad thing. And don't give me an answer in part saying short-term bad, long-term good. Overall, is this a political decision that you were asked about? if you were asked about, would you have said, consented to it or assented to it, saying, yes, this is a great thing to do? And now that you're no longer in government, can you speak candidly about it?
See, I think, let me begin backwards, okay? This is something that's, I will come to, in whatever way I'll answer the question. So I remember once, this is just to make it interesting, otherwise we can do boring, but this is actually quite interesting, and let me show you. In 2016, Raghuram Rajan and I wrote a paper on foreign capital flows, which we presented somewhere. And we were on the flight back with Ken Rogoff. And Ken had been a chief economic advisor to the IMF. Then Raghu was chief economic advisor. And as we were coming back, Raghu had then, I think, just decided to leave. And then I remember Ken telling Raghu, Raghu, what is the next, even better than being a chief economist of the IMF, is being the former chief economist of the IMF, because you can say whatever you want.
Excellent.
And I found this to be so untrue. I think that if you're chief economic advisor, you never really become a former chief economic advisor. In the sense, and this is serious, I'm not being, is that, there are some, responsibilities, maintenance of trust and all these things that come with being a chief economic advisor. So a former chief economic advisor is more chief economic advisor than former. So I think that's a sense in which one has to be, always have that sense of having held office and continuing to in that sense. So that's the.
Can I read a bit from your book?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. A chief economic advisor must be fully supportive of the government without spinning on its behalf. He must combine fidelity to the government with fealty to the larger good. In short, he must try and be both Karan and Arjun.
Yeah.
You're being none right now.
No,
I know, I'm asking you this seriously, because in several places in your book, Dr. Subramanian, you've raised the issue of why people don't speak the truth, whether they're analysts, commentators on the economy, people from within the government. I'll read another bit where you've spoken of the officialdom and why they are not candid about their views on government policy. All officialdom wants validation for its actions. So in the short run, it will want to shape opinion in its favor. But in the long run, that perhaps is not desirable. Public interest is better served by richer debate that encompasses critical views, including those of officialdom. Your chief economic advisor, Karan and Arjun, officialdom. And now I ask you a serious question. As a world-acknowledged talent, as someone who owes it to your field of economics, don't you think that you ought to be able to address, now at least, this question in seriousness?
Yeah, so I think that, I think that in terms of being Karna and Arjuna, right, and I think it's a fair question, the opportunity that I got, my team and I got to do that, was in the economic survey.
Sure.
Right? In the economic survey, just to make it again a bit lively, that when I presented the survey, I began, because I hadn't spoken about demonetization at all, and then I remember the survey, I said, when I introduced this, the Buddhists say you should speak only when you can improve upon the silence, and so I think that I used the economic survey as this, and look, now to get ultra serious without getting into trouble, so in the survey what we did was actually to say, look, as an absolutely cold-blooded economist, if you want to be both Karna and Arjuna, you have to point out both sides of the argument. And I think this morning, in fact, even Pranoy said yesterday, and some friends I respect said yesterday, that if you read the survey, it is actually, it spells out, you didn't want me to say that, all the short-term cost, potential benefits. But in this case, I think that, and you can say that maybe I'm not adhering to my truth to power, whereas I think it's a reconciliation of, the Karna and Arjuna both, which is that you present the costs, you present the benefits, but that final weighting of, I put 0.8 to costs and 0.2 to benefits, which gives me one reductive number. That I'm not willing to do, and I didn't do that, and I'm not willing to do. Partly because I think that, these are decisions taken for whatever reason, and, so I don't add very much, I felt then or even now, by saying, oh no, I think that you should weight the cost X, or the benefits Y, and then say. What I wanted to do in the book is to say, look, all that is, water under the bridge. I don't want to get into who knew what when, because that's for historians.
Fine.
But I did want, and this is what I would urge all of you also partly to kind of move on actually from demonetization, is to say that, look, I learned two new things about demonetization as an analyst. And that I do want people to focus on. I do want people to think about the broader phenomenon, the political phenomenon of why do voters apparently vote against their self-interest. I mean, implicitly, I think we all recognize that there were huge short-term costs imposed, especially on the informal sector, and yet soon after, not forever, but at least soon after, in a very salient way, I think people, certainly didn't go against. If anything, they validated that action. I'm not saying the validation justifies the action. I'm saying that, it's something very interesting. It's a worldwide phenomenon. In the US, you have this as well, where white males vote for Trump, when in fact they need the welfare state most, and he's undermining that. So why is this happening? What does this say about our politics that this happens?
Okay.
Now, then I'll come to the controversial part, the second part, which is, for me, a genuinely important question is, look, we know that growth was decelerating, demonetization aggravated that, along with, let's be honest, GST also contributed to that aggravation.
Correct.
High oil prices, high interest rates, and no one will ever be, unless you do something super fancy and technical, you will never be able to say how much demonetization led, how much of that growth slowdown was due to demonetization, how much due to GST, although I think people should try. But that is orders of magnitude less puzzling and less important than the fact that you cut 86%, which I called draconian, you can call it whatever you want, severe, etc., and yet you see that the impact on measured GDP was fairly minimal. Now, I remember having breakfast with Paul Krugman, who's the world's master modeler, for thing. After demonetization, I said, Paul, how would you kind of model this? And any reasonable economist would have said, you cut cash by 86%, there has to be not just slower growth, there has to be a massive recession in the economy. And it didn't happen. Now, again, by saying this, I don't want to minimize the costs, right? I don't want to do that either. I think they were there. But what does it say about this whole phenomenon? Is it that we're completely not capturing the informal sector in our GDP, which is a huge problem? Is it that we don't understand how cash works in the economy? Or is it that maybe we have a very resilient economy? There are informal social arrangements, credit is extended, whatever happens, and therefore people tide over these things. And I do think that, and this is a mild, let me turn it back at all the people in the media and the political thing. I think that I would certainly like us to understand these things better instead of, did he know, did he not know, etc., etc.
Yeah, so I didn't really mean to ask you, did you know or not know? But I think, and I'm trying to tie this in, and this is really the last thing I want to say on demonetization, given that we didn't want to even talk about it, is that you bring the best of talent from across the world to come and consult a government, right? The framework of that consulting or advisement is loose, as you've pointed out. And you're not able to then take on board either that person's views on critical, very important, epoch-making economic policy decisions, and nor does that person feel comfortable to, even today, after months of having left government, comment on it. I think it speaks very poorly of our political economy that we have not been able to create space for the kind of economic debate that in action of this nature, this serious a nature, should foster. The kind of data work that something like this should foster. But I'll leave Demon there because we have so much more to cover.
Okay.
I want to ask you a question about, and this comes from I live in Mumbai, very far away from power. Can you demystify this government's economic policy for me?
Yeah.
What is it? Is it just a bunch of dots? Is there something that connects them? I'm not able to understand what exactly it is.
See, I think that is a very good question, and I would respond by saying that some things you do, big things, kind of responding to whatever pressing challenges you have.
Right.
And in the case, I would say that the two big achievements of the government were responses to that. I think the GST, which was hanging over, a great thing got done. And the IBC, we've had this twin balance sheet festering in our midst, and the IBC was a response to that, right? So in that sense, you're right, these are not part of some overall vision. But I think if there is an overall vision for this, I would say it is the kind of the Prime Minister's welfareist vision, which is kind of a different kind of welfareism. We've had the old Congress socialist vision. This is a welfareist vision in which the vision is the following, that the state, especially the center, is going to use the latest technology, so there's a big technology component, in order to deliver essential private goods and services to people, especially the poor. So I think this is the animating vision of the Prime Minister, which is that toilets, housing, bank accounts, power, medical insurance, the government will provide it, the government will fund it, using less embrace technology to provide it. But that's the welfareist vision. I think that animates a lot of the vision.
Okay, you've called it an alternative model of social welfareism in the book.
Yeah. By the way, just to sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I think it is it is not a model, or in practice, in which the provision of health, education, especially primary education and health, have necessarily been privileged.
That's what. Okay. So now, since you've given it, a title, an alternative model of social welfareism, and as financial journalists, we want to try and understand what is the policy, what is the architecture, where is this going? Was this predetermined? Did you see this play out in this fashion? This thing that you're talking about, saying, providing private services and goods to people backed by technology. Is it a predetermined strategy, or are you just simply connecting the dots post facto?
I think that some of these things become clearer over time.
Okay.
But I think that there's enough going on here, which is kind of part of a pattern, that it would be unfair to rule out the possibility that ex ante there was something behind this. Because, remember, very early on, one of the first things that the government did was the, Jan Dhan bank accounts. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of, to me at least, my antennae went up in terms of saying, hey, this is something that's kind of interesting. And then over time, you're quite right, it happened sequentially, each of those other things followed. And also the fact of, and this is where I'm not going to claim credit for the whole thing, but the whole JAM, Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile, I just gave it that title. But that kind of, it's really about harnessing technology, which the Prime Minister is very, very keen on and very kind of comfortable with, to harness technology. That's where the JAM came in, but in the service of something that is, really concrete and providing these essential goods and services. And you've seen that happen over time. So your question is right, that maybe not immediately, but there is a pattern here to say, well, there is some underlying vision.
Okay. Many of these schemes, whether it was bank accounts or it was Aadhaar, they were conceptualized in the previous governments. Let me put it that way. I'm not pointing out to any political party, because then it sort of degenerates, the conversation. Right. And this government has definitely done a better job of execution, putting them together and leveraging them together one way or the other. But when you call this an alternative model of social welfareism, how is it welfareism to not give adequate attention to primary health and primary education, something that you yourself have raised in your book, that they didn't get the attention they deserved? Yeah. A welfare state would give that possibly the first piece of attention. The second bit, how is it welfareism to do demonetization that hurts the sector that contributes 40-50% to your economy and is the weakest sector, just ahead of introducing something as disruptive as GST, which in the countries that it has been introduced, we know causes at least 2-3 years of disruption as the formalization process plays out. So how is any of this welfareist?
Okay, so I think there are two separate parts to this question. The first is the critique on health and education. I think, but of course, I don't know enough about this whole Ayushman scheme, so I think some of that maybe is being addressed to that. So, but I don't know enough. But I think the broader point that primary basic health services and primary basic health education. Now, I think that's a fair critique. But remember that is something that has not happened in India for 70, 75 years.
Agreed.
Okay. And I think there are lots of historical reasons for it. And, I don't want to exonerate anyone for this. I think everyone is kind of responsible for this. But in health and education, at least the basic primary things, at least there is this huge additional complication of many of these things being state subjects, and therefore the ability of the center to drive these things. I think it's not negligible, but it's not the main driver of some of these issues. So I think to some extent, the question on health and education that we should ask is not why the central government has not done it, which I think is a fair question, but the question is why haven't over 70 years successive state governments who have the constitutional mandate on this to do this, why haven't they done anything? I think, for example, Manish Sisodia is doing something in Delhi, which I think is very interesting. Yeah. So I think, but I think the deeper question here is that why doesn't Indian politics make the provision of health and education a vote, a politically salient issue? Because unless you get that, pressure from below, I think on health and education, we're always going to be, lagging behind. So yes, health and education have not received the attention, but there are historical reasons, center state, all of that. So I think if you want, everyone is culpable on this. Yeah,
I'm not trying to, sorry to interrupt you, but I'm not trying to point fingers. I'm just trying to connect the dots and understand what have the last 4 years been about from a larger economic architecture. What's this set us up for, over the next 4 or 5 years, right?
So the point I'm making is that, the distinction here between health and education and the other things is that in the other things, the center felt it had the levers that it could push. So the welfare vision was based on the levers it could push, not on the levers it had less control over. So that's, I'm not saying it's justified, but that's the kind of explanation for it. Now, on the other thing, you see, we've spoken about demonetization. On the GST, how is GST welfareist? There, I think that's a little bit of a question that I'm going to push back on, because, the short-term costs of GST were hopefully always going to be temporary costs, and they were going to be harnessed for a larger good.
Now, may I just correct my question? Sorry, I don't mean, I'm actually in favor of GST. I just meant the timing. You knew as a government that you were going to push hard for GST. You knew that the very states that were opposing GST when the previous government were in power are now today your states in which your party has power, and you can bring the consensus. You worked very hard to bring the consensus to the table. You do demonetization 1 year before GST, knowing fully well that GST, however required it is to build one market in this country, is a disruptive force. We know that. It will take 2 years, 3 years for traders, etc., to settle in. So I'm not able to understand how I can take the quick succession of Demon and GST and marry that to your view that this is a government that believes in a different alternative welfare state economic policy. That's what I'm trying to fit.
Yeah, I think it's a fair question to ask. I do say in the book that GST implementation was partly kind of burdened by demonetization having preceded it, because they both affected the same constituency,
correct, yes.
right? The informal sector and so on. So I think that's a very valid question. In fact, one of the wistful questions that I ask looking back is, what if GST had been implemented without having had to also take on the burden of demonetization? I think it's a very fair question that people should ask, and it's a fair question. And also, let's be honest, I think that on the GST, maybe the design could have been better, could have been simpler. And I think that's I think a legitimate question that everyone should ask.
If only they had listened to everything you set out in your report.
I don't want to say that because I think certainly, but I do think that even now, this is a question I would urge the media and everyone. I don't think you should make the GST about why there isn't one rate, because I think there never will be. But I think we should force the GST Council, all the centre and the state governments to say no more than 3 rates going forward. Yeah. The core middle, and then one for essentials and one for luxuries, and nothing else. Even the cesses, for example, are overly complicated. We should just have, fold all that into one rate and make the design much simpler.
Okay, fair enough. That point bought. Back to alternative model of social welfareism, and the last bit here that I want to push back on this assessment of yours is I won't call it neglect, but the very little attention that has been paid over the last 4 or 5 years on the agrarian economy. We're seeing it come home to roost today as we look at, pre-election outcomes. We will see it impact us next year as well. We're seeing it undermine economic growth in a very big way. We're seeing it in real human distress. This is something that you've written about, was one of the big learnings, in the Indian economy for you as well. 3 years, we didn't do much on the MSP front. Suddenly this year, we announced an MSP. Then we put paddy into it, which you've criticized yourself in the book. It's not very clear. What is the policy to be able to deal with the part where half the country lives?
Look, I think in agriculture, I think the fact that agriculture is where it is, I think it's a very fair question. I think, to me, first begin with the analytics, and then I'll answer your question, right? To me, I came here knowing nothing about Indian agriculture. I had worked on manufacturing, trade, services. So it was a real learning experience to have to work on agriculture here. So when, in the first 2 years of the government, there was a drought, right? And so obviously there was, this whole, how do we protect farmers against the downsides, right? And so we did that. But then what I think became clear to me, at least analytically, was when we had this 4, 5, 6 seasons of a good monsoon and good production, why even in those years or seasons did agricultural prices go down so much that farm incomes were hurt, even in outcomes that were meant to be? So we had this paradoxical situation where you have bad monsoons, the farmer is adversely affected, but if you have good monsoon, also the farmer is affected.
Because of excess supply.
Normally excess supply never leads to such a, the correlation broadly is, if you have good monsoons, prices will come down, but not come down so much that incomes will be affected. So we want good monsoon. So the question really is, why did prices come down so much in response to supply? Now, my own view is that, something has changed about the agricultural economy. Maybe partly it's demonetization as well, where, there's not enough cash. So, maybe the cash cycle affects agriculture much more, and we need to look into that. But then we come to, therefore, the policy response. I think the policy response here has been doing the same thing over again, back to the MSP. And, I've been critical of that. It's also that I think people don't realize that, remember, in some sense, to be fair to the government, even though I was critical of this, the great economist, agricultural economist M.S. Swaminathan recommended this, saying, do it and back it up with procurement. Now, the question is that why doesn't procurement happen well in crops outside cereals? So that's, I think, the question. And so it's not that the state is not able to procure. In rice and wheat, we do brilliantly in procuring, right? But we don't do it in the others, and consistently so. And to me, therefore, there is an underlying political economy here which we need to confront. I think we need to confront the fact that, pulses, farmers, other farmers, just don't have the same political clout that cereals and Punjab, Haryana, whatever, right? And I think we need to be honest. In a lecture that I gave, I say we actually have 2 agricultures. One agriculture that we actually corset and pamper, relatively speaking, and the other that we neglect. And I think we need to be honest about that. But last point I would say here is 2 points. One is I want to make it. One is that I think we have to go to new instruments for this. And the new instrument is that we're not going to raise agricultural productivity so quickly over such a short period of time that we're going to double farmers' incomes. We need to find direct benefit transfers to actually cushion farmer incomes on that. And that's why maybe I'm a little over positive about the Telangana Raitu Bandhu scheme, but I think that's the kind of direction that we have to go. The last point I want to say is a kind of a fairly important political economy point about agriculture. And it applies to the other things as well. Farm incomes, agriculture is under stress, you want to do something, right? So the center wants to do something. Now, the best response in agriculture has to be that the center and the states work together, because many of these things are state subject, irrigation is state subject, all this state subject. But then, you see, there's an interesting political economy here. If you cooperate, then you don't get all the credit for cooperation. So the center then wants to rely on instruments that it controls and saliently can show that it has done that. So this is, I think, a much deeper problem of, the politics of reforms, especially when we have, certain kinds of democratic processes and certain kinds of leaders that, how do you have politically incentive compatible reform? You want to do the reform, but you want all the credit for the reform.
Yeah.
And in the GST, what happened was that luckily that there was a sense that this was a shared exercise, and there was that kind of, and there's also been, bipartisan consensus over the years and so on. And Minister Jaitley did a terrific job of, bringing everyone, forging the consensus. But I think it's a much deeper problem that if cooperative federalism is the way forward, how do you, make it politically, incentivize it, because you want to do it, but you want all the credit for it. And that, is difficult. And then if you want all the credit, you have to rely on the instruments that only you control. And then that's the second or third best or fourth best instrument.
Yeah, and let's not forget in GST, it's the states that give up more of the power than the center did, in fact. But I have 22 questions left, and we have 5 minutes, and we want to take some questions from the audience as well. So I'm going to run through this almost like a rapid fire. You watch Karan Johar on TV?
No, I haven't.
You watch Munna Bhai, it's in your book?
Yeah, that I watched with my son actually many years ago, yeah.
Okay, fine. So we'll do a quick rapid fire, the key core of your thought on some of these issues, right? Look, I've anticipated that GST would take us at least 2-3 years to settle in. I get this, the multiple rate structure. It is a political reality. We can keep arguing about it. I hope one day they converge to your revenue neutral rate of 15 somewhat percent, but it's going to take a while. What I'm concerned really about today is GST revenue and the compliance rates. We're still below 70% in terms of filings, and the numbers don't really add up to the targets that the government has set out for this particular fiscal year.
Yeah.
So a quick answer on GST.
Quick answer on GST is that, look, this is something, I think all this compliance that's not happening, I think we need to follow up on that. I think that's something that hopefully the technology will allow us to do that. That I don't know enough about. I think absolutely we must do that. But on that revenue, there's an important point I want to make that, a little bit that you've also slipped into that thing is to judge the GST by what the budget demands of the GST is unreasonable.
Okay.
Because the budget has made, frankly, I can say this, unreasonable demands on the GST.
Okay.
It's asked for 16-17%. What you should ask of the GST is the following. If the economy is growing at 11-12%, are GST revenues giving you 12-13% or not?
Okay.
And I'm hoping that so far we're on track. And also please don't forget, all of you here and listening, that, this year, some of the rates were slashed quite a bit. So, you have to take that account. I hope Amitabh is nodding his head in assent. So you have to factor that into account as well, that you have to measure it relative to how much is the economy growing, what did we do to tax rates, and if you combine the two, do you get enough or not? And my early calculation, at least when I left 6 months ago, was that it was doing, surprisingly well on the revenue front. I hope maybe it could change. I'm not saying that will continue, but we need to monitor it, but apply the right benchmark to that, not what the budget was demanding.
I have a feeling if I ask Amitabh, is the budget too aggressive, he might not answer.
Yeah, that's true, that's true.
Okay, GDP data. We're a data-starved country. We now have 4 series, sir. I'm not able to understand. We have one new current series and 3 versions of the old series.
True, yeah.
So which one do you believe? Because there's one old series that the CSO put up, which the Indian Express put up in an article a couple of days ago, was apparently rejected by the government because it apparently showed the UPA growth as being higher than it was even earlier. And so, the data had to be reworked. Then there was the National Statistical Commission series that also was rejected. And now there is a Niti Aayog. Curiously enough, none of the statisticians, have put this out, but the Niti Aayog has put out an old series, which apparently is the relevant series. Which series do you believe? And you get only a one-line answer.
No,
no, you do.
Yeah.
Which series do you believe?
Yeah.
The first old series, the second old, the CSO old series, the NSC old series, or the Niti Aayog old series?
The thing is that I just don't know enough about the methodology to say which series. But I will. But I'm not ducking. But I will say one thing very important and strong, that this new series that's been created, as an economist, I have to be frank and say that it raises a lot of questions about, if you look at the other indicators during that period and during this period, and you see big differential, and yet the growth numbers are the same, it demands explanation and rationalization. I cannot provide that because I don't know it enough. Therefore, what I would say categorically is, this is a very technical subject that we should only have technical experts opining, doing this. So, and it has become a matter not just of the credibility of whatever day series, but about the credibility of the data generating process and institutions in India. And therefore, I think to convince everyone, ourselves, the world, that we are a nation that produces reliable numbers, I think this is a matter that should be immediately, quickly handed over to the experts and get all the experts that we need, and then have an expert technical view, not associated with any other institutions who do not have expertise in this matter.
Okay.
I hope that's clear.
I mean, they all claim to be technical experts, so I'm not sure which one you're referring to.
No,
I think Niti Aayog said we are technical experts. The CSO is a technical expert body.
I think that's an excessive claim, I think.
Okay. Yeah. So you answered my question. Of the three, you rely on the first two, maybe. Okay. So you've said that the GST data, indirect tax, which is about 50-60% of the tax collection in this country, might be a bit too aggressive. GDP growth we've discussed. Fiscal deficit. There is an interesting commentary in your book on process integrity in fiscal deficit. I'm so glad you brought it up. For the last 2-3 years, as financial journalists, we've been scratching our heads about this LIC bailing out IDBI Bank, and then ONGC buying HPCL, and more recently PFC buying REC, and all this incestuous activity in the PSU space, if I can call it that.
Very good term.
Well, I don't know what else to call it, right? And then using the NSSE funds, NSSF funds to fund or finance Air India. And this is not just me saying it, but Dr. Subramanian has put this in his book. Now, should we believe the fiscal deficit number at all?
See, I think that it's a very good question. I think that this is again a case where the numbers should, everyone, it's not only should be right, but it should be seen to be right? And therefore, with the deficit, this is, all governments have flexibility on this, because, you say the deficit so much, but then if you finance it by the NSSF, it shows up in the debt, but not the deficit. Very complicated, and I think very opaque and non-transparent. No question about it. And that's part of the reason why I say in the book that, again, instead of pointing fingers and saying, right, wrong, etc., I think we need to, and here, some people may not agree with me, I have a slightly stronger view that we should become less obsessed with numbers on deficit targets. Because, like in education, you say, I'm going to do things according to the test score, then all your teaching becomes to the test rather than providing the real education. So similarly, I think all governments, sometimes do have to calibrate their policy and maybe a little bit of the accounting to meet the target. So what I say is that, whatever, deficit, debt, targets, etc. Very complicated, very difficult to understand, very important. Therefore, we should have something like an independent fiscal council that many countries do, as the FRBM committee recommended.
Correct.
And that was one of those recommendations I was fully a part of and I support. I think we should have that. I think we should have, because we do have mechanisms. The CAG comes, but the CAG thing comes much later. Those reports also are not. I think in real time we need to know, are the growth numbers, get an independent whatever, right? Forecasting. That's what they do in the United Kingdom, for example,
yes.
right? The CBO does it in the US. Yeah. So let's have that, and let's also therefore become a little less obsessed with these targets, because at the end of the day, we have to be sure that something meaningful on policy is being done, and that's not always easy to infer from the outcome.
Okay, fair enough. So you've said GST targets too aggressive, don't believe the GDP data, and don't believe the fiscal deficit number.
I said nothing on the sort.
Okay, tongue in cheek.
Yeah, okay.
Tongue in cheek. Okay. But you said all of this.
Tongue in cheek.
Okay. All right. So that brings me to two quick last questions. Actually, one quick one, and then one I want you to elaborate on, because I think it's going to be very closely connected to next year's election. You started the fire with RBI. I mean, you should admit to it, because it was your
mea culpa.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was your economic survey that said RBI has excess capital. The capital should be transferred. Though, in your survey and subsequently in the book, you have put in caveats that it should be done with the consensus of the RBI, not arm twisting, that it should be done only for bank recapitalization, that it should be done concomitant to certain governance reforms within public sector banks, right? Yeah. It has become a flashpoint today between the government and the RBI, almost to the extent that it's sounding or being perceived as undermining the autonomy of an institution that was otherwise considered independent. Where do you stand on what's gone on over the last couple of weeks?
I think there are two, issues, at least two. One is the actual, excess capital, prompt corrective action framework, all these things. And then the broader, bigger issue of the institutional thing. So let me speak to both. On the narrow one, I want to make very clear that technically, I believe with a great deal of confidence that there are excess reserves. And we have a paper out in EPW, Abhishek is here. We have a paper which
just
goes
got
through
published yesterday.
Yesterday, got published yesterday. All the, ins and outs, all the, you should go and read that. But I think I do not want that technical thing to be any way misconstrued or misappropriated, because I believe, one, in terms of policy, those excess reserves should only be used for recapitalizing the banks, and only if there are concomitant reforms of the public sector banks to ensure that this is money well spent. This money should categorically not be used for deficit financing or expenditure financing, especially ahead of the election. And it should be done cooperatively, not unilaterally. Anything that unilaterally done, I think, which segues to my second thing, is that, the RBI, that in this truth to power thing, I spoke up quite often against the RBI. But I think that the RBI is one of India's most respected and credible institutions for good reason. I think that the independence of that, autonomy of that should be maintained. Any action or even perception that, via the board or whatever, that it's being politicized, which could, reflect on the RBI, I think that's a line too far. And we should really, there are some lines, I think, which should not be crossed. That being said, I think that there's a lot more scope for better cooperation, consultation, communication.
Transparency at the RBI.
Transparency
at the RBI.
Yeah, because as you know, in the book, the RBI has been, at least, huge neglect, if not kind of failure, is part of it. So no one is kind of, blameless or perfect. So I think we should, but I think there is a sense in which RBI's independence, autonomy is sacrosanct. But independence doesn't mean it doesn't come with responsibilities as well.
Okay, one quick serious follow-up and one not so serious follow-up there. Isn't it a bit of fudging if you say that the RBI should use this excess capital only to capitalize banks and not for deficit financing? Well, if it frees up the government from the responsibility of having to capitalize banks that it owns and it's the dominant shareholder in, it can then use that money towards other expenditures. So that it is deficit financing one way or the other, no matter how you account for it, sir.
I think there is you're right, there is a bit of a fungibility there. You're saying that, it is fungibility. No, but I think fungibility is not perfect fully. And I think in this, perceptions matter a lot. I mean, if people have this sense of, this dollar or this rupee is used for this purpose, I think it's important to maintain some sanctity there. And even though, a little bit of the fungibility may be true, but I think because then certainly politically and optically, the principle that this is something that's a balance sheet item, that you just use it to finance current operations, would kind of violate some principle that I think we should not cross.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, I don't want to keep debating this point, but you are the shareholder, predominant shareholder of these banks. You have chosen not to exit from that position. Consciously so, you've kept your ownership for a variety of reasons. I won't put it down to just as simple as why are you not, disinvesting. And therefore, the responsibility to capitalize is yours. And if today the RBI did it as a one-off, tomorrow there would be a variety of different crises in financial institutions or in the financial system that the government would turn around and throw its hands up and say, hey, you've got excess reserve or you've got reserve, why don't you use it? So I wonder if it sets the right precedent.
No, so because it can set a precedent, it should be very tightly caveated.
Okay.
Yeah?
Okay.
And I think, when you say, oh, it's yours, you do it, fair point. But then you have to look at the public sector balance sheet as a whole and say that, yes, I will do it, and I want to find the money where, it has the least, take it from where it has the least return and put it where it has most return. I think government is entitled to do that, but not in an irresponsible, undisciplined fashion.
Okay, point scored. When you said politicization of the board, there were two members that were appointed by the government recently. Which one were you referring to?
As I say that,
come on, Dr. Subramanian, you now commit to someone. No?
By the way, I actually don't know all the. I mean, obviously,
I can name both for you. If you'll pick one, I'll name them. I don't want to name them pointlessly.
I think here we can't. This is not about personalities, right? It is about the principle, and it is about the principle that you're right. The principle arises because the individuals are seen in a particular light. So finally, it is about individuals. But we think we should point fingers and say so and so thing. But the perception that this is getting politicized and this is happening is something that we should avoid.
Okay. Many people thought that maybe the government wants the excess capital of the Reserve Bank of India because it's not going to be able to meet its fiscal deficit target this year. The government came out and said, hey, but no, we're on track. We're going to meet it, aggressive GST targets or not. So I have this theory that I'm going to put to you and I want you to tell me if it's true or not. And it links into one of the pet subjects over your 4 years here in India and in your book. Is the government looking for additional money or funding or additional space, let me put it that way, fiscal space, to do a universal basic income plan ahead of the 2019 elections? Okay. Now, you've called it a QUIB, QBI, quasi-UBI. So should we expect a UBI next year? Will it work? Does it have to work with tweaks? You've spoken of Raitu Bandhu in Telangana. There are several negatives to that as well that need to be ironed out. So that's my last question to you. 2019, is the UBI going to be the big, economic pot of gold?
So here's a prediction I'm making, and this is something new. My hunch or prediction is that every major party's manifesto will have some kind of universal basic income in it. I hope it'll happen. I think it'll happen, but I'm saying both a positive and a normative thing. The positive is a prediction that it will happen. I might be wrong on this. And the normative is that it would be very good, it could happen. Now, the thing here is that why I think I see future for this in India, the UBI. It's still not happened. First, I've actually spoken to a few chief ministers, very thoughtful chief ministers, who really like the idea. And for good reason, not for populist reason, but for good reason. I mean, I know, I don't want to name names. Actually, I've named him in the book. I mean, he said, look, this chief minister said, I have all this PDS, all this other social welfare thing. The thing just doesn't work. Leakage, whatever. I think UBI is promising. I think we don't have the infrastructure yet, but I think, second thing is that, when I was in government, Kashmir Hasib Drabu was actually very seriously thinking about this. And what makes it such a tantalizing, exciting prospect in India is that the central government doesn't have to do it on its own. State governments can turn to the center and say, look, I want to do it. I will finance part of it, as indeed Jammu and Kashmir was willing to. I finance part of it, but the rest, I want it from you, but I don't want new money from you. Whatever you're giving me as saying do it for this, this and the other, just untie that and allow me to use it. And if that dynamic takes hold, I think that the items in the manifesto can get translated into actual action over the next 5 years.
It's an extensive topic. I don't think we'll get to the heart of UBI in the next minute or two, but fiscally, is it a prudent thing to do? And if a state was going to get the benefit from having to implement this, will the centre actually consider a nationwide UBI next year, or believe that it might not give it the electoral currency that, something like this should or would or could?
Actually, it goes back to the earlier points that we were discussing that, if the centre wants credit for it,
correct.
And if it promises it on its own, then the fiscal space would be a serious issue.
Right.
Then, of course, my favorite thing is that in the survey we said, even at the centre, there are so many subsidies and kind of what we call bounties to the middle class that we give, which I think should be on the table, but I'm not that hopeful about.
Okay. So no fiscal space, according to you, but lots of political.
Yeah, I think the states can do it more because of this tied and untied
correct.
aid. I think the centre can do a little bit because I think there is. I mean, the fertilizer subsidy. My friend Bala is sitting here, and he thinks I didn't work enough on the fertilizer subsidy, but I was obsessed with the fertilizer subsidy when I was in government because I think there's almost nothing that redeems this subsidy. That's something that should go, and that can provide, and things like that can provide space.
Okay. If there are any questions in the house, we can get to them first. I think there's a gentleman there, so we're passing the mic around. Okay.
Hello.
Hi. Please introduce yourself quickly and less comment, more question.
Yeah. My name is Vaibhav. I am student. First of all, sir, I'm very thankful to you because of the rudimentary knowledge of economics I owe to you.
Thank you. My team who worked with me. Yeah.
Your lectures and economic survey have been grateful delight to ordinary Indians. Now my question is rather personal one. As I have learned that you once prepared for civil services, as someone on that path, I would like to elucidate on that experience.
So let me just respond. So I must say one of the, you said list your successes, whatever, and I feel a bit, I don't think we should be vain. But two nights ago in Bombay, after the event in Bombay, I was sitting having dinner with some colleagues, Josh Feldman, who's here, and a young girl came up to me and said, whatever, as sweetly as you did, that, sir, we're very grateful to you for one thing. So I said, what? She said, we're very grateful to you for having said publicly that you failed the civil service exam. And so I was intrigued. So she said, we're grateful because here is a person who said publicly that he failed the civil service exam, and he's written stuff that millions of people are reading in order to qualify for the civil service exam. So that's a very inspirational story. And thank you, not just for the service, but also for...
killing the taboo, right? Killing the stigma.
So I think that, failing this, I wish you success, you must think. But if you fail, it's not the end of the world. Huh?
Not everybody who fails becomes chief economic advisor. And anyways, it's a definitionless job, so as Sir has pointed out. Anybody else with questions? Varun, it's in your control. You can pass it around.
Yeah, I have a question. Just drawing a parallel between climate change and the economic crises that I think is, at least my view, is prevalent in the world today, with rising deficits, GDP debt versus GDP deficits. The climate scientists are pretty almost strident in their calling, a spade a spade. Do you think too many economists have become too close to political power and too close to the political system to be able to actually speak their mind and warn of impending economic dangers that might be looming out there, where issues are sort of being glossed over, where the next generation is going to have to pay the price of the problems that have been built up in the economic system?
But what does it have to do with climate change? Are you saying it's
I think the scientists have been more visible, more loud about the issues that are going to confront the planet. Have leading economists been as
I think so,
loud
yeah.
in calling a spade a spade?
It's kind of a question that you asked earlier. It relates to the truth to power question. Of course, this was a question that was raised about the global financial crisis. Famously, Queen Elizabeth II said, what were these guys doing? And I think in that case, it was less a matter of, being too close to the political system, as it was a case that, I think they got hung up on their models and were genuinely not able to kind of think beyond them. So there was a competence issue. Whether or not there was a kind of being compromised issue is another question. But the point you raise is a very good one. I think that, but the solution to that would be for me to be very simple. That and this comes back to the truth to power thing. That every ecosphere should have people who are completely distant from power, economists, and economists who are inside, close to power, because then you can get the true range of opinions that you want. You can't say no economist should be close to power, because I think that's an extreme statement. I think being in power, being able to influence has, potential big advantages. But it is true that being close to power creates its own constraints. Maybe even I'm an example of that, as you were trying to point out. So we need that whole spectrum of opinions and voices, and that's what all societies need. And that's why I think a vibrant think tank education system in India that in real time is challenging government at every point, I think is very, very important.
All right. How much time do we have? A couple of more questions? 5 more minutes? Okay, quickly.
Hello, so my name is Mahesh. I'm Assistant Commissioner posted in GST Council. It was very refreshing to hear you in council meetings. I'm sure the council is going to miss it.
You're talking about the GST Council?
Yeah.
I miss the GST Council too.
So if you could talk a little bit more about Track 2.0 discussions there, the discussions you had with J&K FM or Kerala FM, the GST Council that could have been.
Yeah, I think, it's actually something that I kind of, again, allude to in the book, that, could, not retrospectively, in real time, could things have been different from what they turned out to be?
Yeah.
And that's, so here's, I think, a strong statement I will make. I think that in real time also, the 28% rate could have been avoided. I think. Because remember that once the states were promised their minimum 14% compensation, I think then you saw it subsequently, it was all about cutting taxes. So getting the lower taxes proved to be not that difficult, although the way it happened was in a complete ad hoc and random way rather than in a principled way that could have happened. So I think that 28% I think could have been avoided, especially since many of, as you said, many of the state governments were actually BJP governments, right? And and I think there was a general feeling that high taxes are bad politically, and therefore you could avoid it. What I think is less obvious to me, it's still a problem, because remember, a simple structure required no big rate, 28 apart from the essentials and luxuries, but also not a series of low rates. Having the lower rate, the essentials rate, at a sufficiently high level whatever, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever, that would have been a little bit more difficult getting that, because there you're raising taxes on goods that are, whatever. And that, I think, is where I think there may have been more difficulty. But I think, more simplicity than what we achieved was conceivable, I think, even in real time.
Yeah, better preparedness. Look, I think GST is good intentions, but just maybe didn't get the implementation that it deserved, given the challenges that something like this anyways would have faced nationwide, right?
Yeah.
Let's be realistic about that.
Hi, my name is Vignesh. Congratulations on your book. My question is, sir, I think after the economic surveys that I've read, the last one that you wrote about the India's missing women.
Missing girls.
Missing girls. I think that's one of the phenomenal data that you have put out. And could you care to comment more on it and how the origin of that whole discourse came in? The second thing is, as an economist, now we are fond of counterfactuals, as you like to put it. So in that sense, the two events that we generally talk about, the GST and demonetization. So have you ever pondered on that, were it to be reversed? So for example, for the GST were implemented and then the demonetization came in, would the impact have been, what would have been the impact of?
Okay, two great questions. I very much...
Can I add to the first one? Why didn't you put missing girls in the book?
Yeah, so that's easy to think, because most of the stuff that's here, I didn't want to put stuff that had come out in the survey too much. Some of it is there, but most of it is not there.
Okay.
But the first question is I think that missing girls is just a great example of teamwork in this. And let me just elaborate on that. So that every survey, we've always wanted to do something on women. And if you notice, each of the surveys had something on women. Obviously, I'm not going to say, we should have had much more. So I don't want to any way pretend that, we kind of did a great job on gender. I think we did try and, do this every survey. Now, in the last survey, what happened was that we were working, saying what gender issue should we really focus on. And we did some, we had some ideas. But then I had read a paper by this economist, female economist in the US called Seema Jayachandran, a very brilliant economist. And she had this thing of, you should focus on the sex ratio of the last child. And, Amartya said, look at the sex ratio at birth. So we had animated discussions within the group, and I kept pushing my group and saying, this is something interesting we should do. And then, as a result of those discussions, everyone gets credit, but especially someone in the audience here gets, Abhishek, please stand up. Abhishek had the killer final idea that actually allowed us to come up with this thing of missing girls. And I remember when he produced that chart, of course, other colleagues also helped him, it was a collective discussion. But when he came in with that chart one day, a few weeks before the survey, I saw it and I was just stunned. And then of course, after it came out, Professor Seema Jayachandran herself has been, very positive about that. And I think it really is a new kind of insight into the sex thing, a sex ratio thing, which I think we're really very, very proud of that. On your second question, it's a terrific question. I would say that, had we done GST, would we then have realized that maybe the demonetization may not have been worth doing? Is a kind of question that I think we should, maybe it's a counterfaction that I would love to think about. But it's true that, maybe if the GST had been implemented, maybe we'd have, and especially, if land and real estate had been brought into the GST, to me, that was a really a less heavy-handed way of tackling corruption, black money, which I think, had it paid dividend, maybe we could have said, yeah, we've done, we're making progress, let's pursue this line, then alternative lines.
Yeah, I think land, you've spoken of land, gold.
Gold, yeah.
Higher rate on gold as opposed to just the 3% rate.
I would urge all my GST friends to read, there's an introductory section to the GST section. So Amitabh, please distribute it to everyone in North Block and the GST Council, where I talk about land and real estate and gold.
One last question.
Good evening, sir. My name is Adhya. First of all, I would like to begin with a personal observation. It seems that the loss of civil services fraternity is a gain for core economics, given the way you have gone about putting out the economic surveys. So
Thank
that
you,
was
thank you,
excellent.
thank you. Yeah.
I have two very brief questions. First of all, you commended the Raitu Bandhu scheme of Telangana for its direct benefit transfer. I would like to ask as to how do the states go about identifying the beneficiaries, as to the fact remains that a major share of farmers are tenants and sharecroppers. They are not going to benefit.
Yeah, I guess that's what you had in mind by saying it's the shortcomings of this. It's a terrific question. And let me say that why I've been impressed by the Raitu Bandhu scheme, and this I'm going on the numbers that the state government and the chief minister presented to me, that it was just a phenomenal exercise in state capacity because, and actually another IAS officers here, can you stand up, my friend from Hyderabad, say your name? Yeah, Satyanarayana was actually in the Telangana Chief Minister's office, I think also involved in this scheme, that how they managed to title land and associate it with people, because without that you can't do it, right? And apparently, and land is so hotly demanded and contested that to actually be able to title and do this, and apparently there was about 7% was still open, 93% was I think done. Correct me, Satyanarayana? Yeah. So, but even achieving 92% over such a short period of time was phenomenal. Now, I think for other states to do this would be very challenging. Karnataka is doing it and finding difficulty doing a good job of this. But other states need to do it because it would have other benefits in any case. But you're right, it only gives those. But the theory, which I think is not implausible, the theory is that you give it to the owners, but then market and contracts and contracting would at least partly transfer the benefits to the tenant farmer. So that's the theory. Whether it's working in practice or not, we have to see. But it's not or put it differently, the fact that we cannot, help the tenant farmer or the landless laborer should not, I think, come in the way of not trying the scheme at all, because I think we should do it and then find ways of solving, the landless laborer, tenant farmer problem.
So my last question was that regarding the IBC, you have been very optimistic about it, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. But in the recent times, we have had judicial interventions, even the Sunil Mehta committee was appointed, and we have seen some dilution in the IBC timeline, given the fact that IBC was one of those measures which should have resolved the NPAs in a time-bound manner. But there has been some dilution on part of the government. I think the media has come up with that dilution part. So how do you see that going forward?
See, I don't know whether we have time for...
Well, this is your event, sir. We do?
No, okay. I think I also, we will have to keep time for, there are lots of people who want to...
Sign books. But yes, we should not disappoint the audience.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, so I think, I firmly believe that the IBC was a really transformational thing, because without it, we were going nowhere, right? And I think this was very important. But it's true that the process had turned out to be more overloaded, more delays than we had anticipated. But I think some of that is teething problem, but some of it I think we need to address as well. For example, the power sector, it has so many unique problems. Whether it should be done through the NCLT or to some other process is something that we have to think about. Also, should we beef up the NCLT? What do we do with the appellate tribunal? So I think a lot more needs to be, we need to invest probably also more capacity in being able to make this handle more cases. But it seems to be a very, maybe not the only game in town, but actually quite an important part of the process.
Yeah. Ma, thank you very much to all of you. My apologies.
No.
Dr. Subramanian, I think we wanted to talk about the IBC. We wanted to talk about your concepts on stigmatized capitalism, the Abhimanyu Chakraview and the issues with exit. Even just the Universal Basic Income Scheme deserved at least 15-20 more minutes of discussion, but time always gets ahead of us. Thank you for being a very responsive audience on a Sunday evening. I think that's really very fabulous. And a big round of applause and best wishes to Dr. Subramanian for his book. Okay. If the UBI scheme does happen, you will come back to India and talk about it, right?
I will come back to India just to claim credit for it.
Even if we don't have the fiscal space to do it and we're juggling numbers around.
Right.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.